Broadcasting from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Welcome to the Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. There's obviously a lot of news going on. If you haven't been listening to the Stephanie Miller or Tom Hartman shows yet today, catch up on all the headlines with their shows on demand. Even better, the Matt McNeil show is coming up next at 3 p.m. I know he's going to have a great show for you. For us today, it's our Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. Today's guest is Dr. Samuel Clues-Huneke, returning to the show because I have lots to talk with him about. Dr. Huneke is a historian of modern Europe and an associate professor of history at George Mason University. His first book was States of Liberation, Gay Men Between Dictatorship and Democracy in Cold War Germany, where that book examines gay persecution and liberation in Germany during the Cold War. Check out our conversation from February 13th, all about it. His newest book came out this year. He co-edited Reimagining Citizenship in Post-War Europe with Dr. Rachel Chin. The volume brings together a diverse group of scholars to illustrate how citizenship was reimagined in the post-war decades in unusual settings and unexpected ways. However, holding it up for folks on YouTube, what we're going to talk about today is Dr. Huneke's second book, A Queer Theory of the State. It came out in 2023 and asked the questions around what kind of state government can queer theory help us create? So welcome back to the show, Sam.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay. So tell us how this book got started with monkeypox.
So yeah, it starts with monkeypox, but that's not sort of how I first conceived of it. It sort of has a different genesis. So maybe I'll tell you that story and then how monkeypox figures in. So starting when I was a PhD student, I got into reviewing books for non-academic magazines. And one of them that I was writing for was The Point magazine, which occupies sort of a weird place in the kind of political spectrum of these magazines. And I started reviewing books about queer history for them. And I finally wound up reviewing a book called The Last Man Takes LSD, which is an intellectual biography of Michel Foucault. And I don't know, I was skeptical of the book. It was a very thought-provoking book. And in that review, I pointed out that there was no queer theory of the state, that essentially queer theory, and especially the kind of queer theory that got its start with the work of Michel Foucault, didn't really have a lot to say about the state, about government. It had a lot to say about queer life. It had a lot to say about the ways that kind of ordinary life and norms and the way that we essentially treat each other oppressed queer people and structured queer life. And it certainly didn't have very much to say about what a state could do for queer people. And so I then, after pointing that out, took it upon myself to then go and write a longer essay called Towards a Queer Theory of the State, which The Point then published a couple of years later. And then actually the publisher of Floating Opera Press, which is the press, it's a small independent press based in Berlin that published this book, contacted me and said, would you want to turn this essay into a standalone book? And I, of course, was thrilled with the idea and took about another year and a half to do that. Now, monkeypox sort of hit in the middle of this. And to me, it became this perfect encapsulation of many of the issues I was trying to distill and discuss in this book and resolve. In particular, for those who don't remember, in 2022, monkeypox hit. This is the middle of Joe Biden's presidency. This was a disease that had not been common in the Western world. It has certain similarities to smallpox. And it seemed to be spreading primarily sexually through sexual contact, largely between gay men. And the Biden administration really kind of dragged its feet on this. And as someone who lives in DC, I have friends who work in and around government, and talking with them was really enlightening. They were incredibly frustrated with this. And part of what I gathered is it actually came from a sense of not wanting to stigmatize queer people, that they were dragging their feet, or at least that was one of many reasons. I think there was initially a skepticism about how serious it was, but there was also a desire not to go out and say, oh, you know, there's another disease spreading among gay men. And so that led to this kind of slowdown. Eventually, though, the administration did get a ton of the smallpox vaccine that was given out to treat it, to inoculate against it. And essentially, it went back to being a very rare, uncommon disease. And as that summer, as I was parsing what people were saying about it and doing about it and protesting and so on, it occurred to me that there were two strikingly different interpretations. There was the interpretation that said, this is just like the AIDS crisis. This is the government. It is willfully, neglecting us. It is unwilling to help us. We're on our own, and we have to sort of band together. And then there was the other thought, or the other sort of perspective, that said, actually, this was a very successful government intervention in health, right? This ultimately, there was some foot dragging, there were some issues, but ultimately, the government got its act together and it solved this public health crisis. And so that's sort of the initial anecdote of the book, and that problem of we have the same facts, the same set of events that people agree on, and two radically different interpretations about how to see it. And that's sort of where the book then introduces into the larger problem of how do queer people think about the state.
If you're just tuning in, my guest is Dr. Samuel Clues-Hunicke. We're talking about his 2023 book, A Queer Theory of the State. In everyday language, I was trying to do this myself earlier today, prepping for this. In everyday language, how would we introduce folks to what queer theory is?
I
know, right? Because it's not necessarily a literary analysis theory, even though there's a lot of that there.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just a political theory. Like, how do we do this for folks who aren't?
So, queer theory is a large and sort of messy body of scholarship. And I like to say, first of all, it largely deals with sex, gender, and sexuality. That's the stuff that it's interested in. It generally takes as a proposition that identities and sort of categories are historically determined, that they change over time, and that there's not a lot of kind of inherent truth to those categories. And so in particular, when it's thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality, the idea that there is a quote unquote homosexual, right? We understand that is a historically constructed idea. The word homosexual is only invented in the 19th century. The idea that if you are a man who has sex with men or a woman who has sex with women, that somehow defines your character and defines who you are, that's a very modern contemporary idea. If we go back to medieval or ancient cultures, they do have sexual identities, they have gender identities, but they're very different from the ones that we have today. And from that instability and sort of contingency of categories, queer theory develops a kind of skepticism and a critique towards anything that is sort of taken for granted, towards norms, towards any kind of underlying assumptions that we might have, particularly when it comes to sex, gender, and sexuality. And I'll add that generally queer theorists are skeptical because they see those underlying assumptions and norms as inherently insidious. That is, that there is something bad about them. There's something that is limiting human freedom or human potential in those norms. And so, for instance, queer theory in general is very skeptical of the institution of marriage, right? Which many people today see as this sort of natural, historically constant thing, institution. Of course, historians know that it is not. It's changed dramatically across cultures and across time. But in general, queer theorists would say that marriage as it is currently structured is a very sort of patriarchal, heteronormative institution that is designed to, again, limit human choice, human freedom, and human potential.
This is why you're the professor and I am not the professor. And but something I want to get to, though, is that you have something in here that I had never. My introduction to queer theory was in my undergrad, where I was doing an interdisciplinary degree, and obviously I wanted to find out what are the queers doing, and I did not enjoy queer theory because of something that you wrote in the book. which is a con of the theory can be its, and I'm going to quote directly here, the inability to think constructively, that it's hamstrung by reflexive critique.
Mhm.
And what I was having panic attacks about was, okay, yes, we can deconstruct something here, but what do we build up in its place? And there was no building up of anything in its place. It was just this constant, well, if you do this, then this is going to be the problem with it. And if you do this, this is what's the problem with that. And and ultimately that's why I just sort of walked away, and I was like, I literally cannot handle this, because at the end of the day, I live in, at the time, Michigan, which is a nightmare state. And I don't know how to get rid of these amendments and how to get rid of these politicians if everything I do is you're going to constantly come for and critique.
Right.
And it was like in the first few pages, I read that and I was like, oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you for at least acknowledging it, right? And then because you name it, and then you're able, and I just even felt a breath of fresh air, like, okay, I feel like now that it's been acknowledged, I can more effectively engage with this, which is what you're doing throughout the entire book. And all that being said, I have less than 2 minutes before our break here. Maybe we can start this question then of why has queer theory had little interest as a place of analysis of government, of the state, proactively, rather?
I'll see if I can do this in 2 minutes.
Start it, and then I'll interrupt, and we'll go to break, and then we'll come back and continue.
So I think there are two reasons. One reason has to do with the kind of critique and the kind of philosophical background that queer theory comes out of. So I mentioned Michel Foucault already. Essentially, Michel Foucault, French philosopher, very important. In the 70s, he publishes The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which for queer theorists, for historians of sexuality, is a massively important book because it really forcefully argues, again, that sexuality is a historical construct, that homosexuality and other sexual identities sort of arise in the 19th century, and that they are social constructs and that they are able to change. And in making that argument, Foucault is not saying that governments, that, the French government or the German government or the British government invented this. What he's saying is that through ordinary society, through the work of scientists and doctors and so on, these ideas kind of bubble up and they start shaping how people see themselves, how they see other people, how they behave, how they even understand what's possible.
Perfect. We're going to pause right there. We're going to take a short break. We're going to have more with Dr. Samuel Kloos-Hünicke when we come back. Welcome back to the Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 21 minutes past the hour. That's very upbeat music for our Thinking Queerly episode. For this week, my guest is Dr. Samuel Kloos-Hünicke. Dr. Hünicke is a historian of modern Europe and an associate professor of history at George Mason University. Also, the project director of the East German Poster Database, a digital project funded by the Fenwick Fellowship from the George Mason University Libraries, which will make the university's collection of 7,000 posters from the GDR available to researchers and students. Dr. Hünicke, let's pick it up there about, and I know some people will be listening and going, oh, this is an academic argument, but we really need to respond to the moment that we're living in, the sort of neo-fascist MAGA moment. And so we need to have a sense of us as the other side, us as the progressives. And you mentioned progressives a lot in this book, which is why I wanted to talk to you, given our audience, how we're going to have a vision of government when we take back control in 2028. Knock on wood.
I like your optimism.
Okay. It's all I have left. And so let's pick it up then of why queer theory hasn't yet had a proactive. It's been a lot of critique of the state, of government. Why haven't they traditionally, as a movement, as a theoretical movement, as an academia, engaged with government?
Yeah. So part of it, just to sort of finish up that first part, the philosophy is very interested in daily life and ordinary interactions in sort of institutions that are sort of on the ground, like schools, clinics, universities, prisons, that sort of thing. They're not generally interested in what's going on in sort of high politics. They're not interested in laws, legislation, policy, that sort of thing. The other reason is that historically, when queer theorists and queer historians have looked to the past and looked at the relationship between queer people and states in the past, generally it is a relationship of violence. Generally, states have persecuted queer people. And in particular, once we get the kind of modern queer subject, so gay men, lesbians, trans people, and we sort of go back in history looking for kind of usable ancestors, people who kind of look like us, and we can point to the past and say, hey, look, those people existed too. Those people, more often than not, we know about them because they were persecuted, because they were put on trial, because they were executed, because they were put in prison, what have you. In fact, in my own field of modern German history, the origins of queer history are in studying the Nazi persecution of queer people. And so it is very much the case that when we go looking for empirical evidence of how queer people have engaged the state, it's usually that queer people are sort of hiding from the state, and the state is interested in exterminating queer life in one way or another. So because of those two reasons, queer theory has generally been either uninterested in the state or very skeptical of the state and interested in sort of rejecting state power.
And so perfect examples of this, everything that's happening today under this current administration. But going back, Eisenhower's executive order, which started the Lavender Scare, getting rid of, LGBTQ people from the federal workforce. We have laws banning LGBTQ books. We have the, examples of the, the Reagan administration, Thatcher administration, basically all the administrations ignoring AIDS and not putting any governmental research or funding behind it. We have the constitutional bans against marriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You quote Wendy Brown in your book of, we know what is wrong with this world, but cannot articulate a way out. I have been living with this quote since I read this in the early part of this year. And it feels very apropos of the moment, because 86% of queer folks voted for the Harris-Walz ticket. And obviously, everybody sort of agrees of everything that's, awful about the current administration. But the minute we start to talk about the way out, everything seems to break down on our side of things. Also feels like anti-hypocrisy, right? You talk about this a lot, about the hypocrisy that comes with a liberal government. Also feels like it's been co-opted by MAGA and the fascists to be like, see, look, they're hypocrites. Therefore, there's the deep state and the failures of the Democratic Party. So, let's run with that. You're already thinking it anyway and talking about it. So we're just going to take it to what they feel is their logical conclusion. Which leads you to the question that, so Wendy Brown's quote has stuck with me. The question that you ask is, what happens after you expose the violence of state power? Right. What happens?
Right. So basically, I think queer theories, very good, and sort of allied disciplines in the humanities and social sciences are very good, and have been over the last 50 years or so, very good at exposing the violence of norms. And a great example of this among historians, among theorists, among social scientists, is peeling back a lot of the assumptions of liberal governance. Right, liberalism, and I don't mean liberalism in the sense that Americans mean it with associating with the left of the Democratic Party. I mean people who believe in limited government, in personal freedoms, in a capitalist market. That these sorts of liberals have been held up for all of my lifetime as the kind of only kind of government possible after the end of the Cold War. And this is, Francis Fukuyama's argument in The End of History, that there are no other options left, there are no ideologies left, it's only liberalism. And queer theory and related disciplines have been really good at peeling back these assumptions and saying, okay, yes, this is a philosophy, a political philosophy that espouses personal freedom, but then under that, there's all kinds of violence going on. Studies of the carceral system, of carceral capitalism in the US are a great example of this. So I do think that's
the carceral system being, for folks who don't engage with that, the incarceration system, right?
Yes, prisons. Essentially how the US, despite being a liberal democracy, locks up more people than any other country on earth, both in absolute numbers and per capita, and which is shocking. And this is, something that both parties have been on board with for many decades now. So that is all important. But as we've been talking about, I think it's important to once you've exposed that, once you've talked about that, to actually then have a replacement for it, to talk about where do we go from here. And I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a politician, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think that when it comes to critique, it needs to be critique with purpose. That means you need to think about who your targets are. You need to think about who you are critiquing and why. If we are critiquing the state because it's locking up too many people, great. If we are critiquing a fellow critic who wants to in some way reform the prison system because their reforms, in our opinion, don't go far enough, that is perhaps not useful. That is perhaps at the end of the day not actually going to move us in the sort of direction that we want. And this is not just an issue with queer theory. I think this is a broader problem on the left that we can see, going back centuries even, that leftists love to snipe at each other.
Can we pick that up right there?
Yes.
Because I've got thoughts about that, but I've got to fit in a break. Please shop and do business with our sponsors and advertisers who make conversations like this possible and broadcast progressive news and talk to the state of Minnesota, actually beyond, when you consider our programs are listened to and watched across the country. Tell them you heard about them on The Gailey Show right here on AM 950 Radio. Coming to you from the studios of AM 950 KTNF, the progressive voice of Minnesota. This is The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. It is 33 minutes past the hour. Hello to those who are streaming on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/@TheGaileyShow. It is our weekly Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode, where we sit down with a guest for the episode to help us think more clearly on the major issues of the day facing the queer and allied community. With me today is Dr. Samuel Clues-Hunicke. Dr. Hunicke is a historian of modern Europe and associate professor of history at George Mason University. We are talking about his 2023 volume, A Queer Theory of the State. Okay, before the break, we were talking about how the left just likes to go at each other. Yes. And I'm a dual citizen of France and the US. And France has a system where, it's a basically runoff system. Right. And it drives me absolutely bonkers that if the left were united, then they would always get the most votes and make it across and have the biggest party in the National Assembly. They'd have the presidency, they'd have everything, basically. And we see they're able to do this more recently in the elections. Right. And then when they get to governance, they just completely fall apart and stab each other in the back. And it's like, why do you even need the far right if they're going to do that? And it feels like here, lately, we're seeing this again between the progressive wing and the centrist Democrats, right? And you have your Bernies and your AOCs who are out getting tens of thousands of people, showing up to rallies and kind of going after the, the establishment Democrats. And then you've got folks like the senator from Pennsylvania, who is taking pot shots and saying, well, the progressives got a lady candidate and y'all look how that turned out.
This drives me up a wall when people describe Kamala as a progressive. I mean,
I know, right?
That's a whole other issue. But no, I think we do see that. Ironically, I think in this case, in the American case, we have the opposite of what you oftentimes see in other scenarios, where it really is the sort of centrist wing. It's the center left that is much more recalcitrant and unwilling to work with the more progressive wing of the party. I think when you look at voting records, when you look at campaigning records, people like Bernie and AOC actually are real team players. They happily raise money for and go out and campaign with their more moderate colleagues. At the end of the day, they vote for party priorities in Congress. It's people like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin who, hold up the party's agenda. And
if we recall, it was a former Speaker of the House, noted centrist, who took out Biden. AOC and Bernie were like, no, they were with him.
Yes, no, they were with him until he withdrew. You're right. It was Nancy Pelosi who ultimately pushed Biden out. And we, I'm not at all convinced in my ability to sort of uh, look back and diagnose what exactly went wrong in the election. But I do think
The larger issue of the left going after each other
right.
and queer theory sort of being in this perpetual critique loop where you never
Mhm.
can sort of get out of that. But there is something, if I may interrupt you, as I'm currently doing, there's something that you talked about in the book about why do you write the status quo is no longer tenable? Why can't the center hold?
Oh,
Because I think that is, I know that's a huge question. We've got some time for it, but it is a big thing that's happening right now. I mean, I was in New York and had like with friends some very heated exchanges about how, they were trying to say, well, AOC is just as bad as Marjorie Taylor Greene, and my eyes literally popped out of my head. I
I
had to
just
put them back in there. And they're like, the extremes, we can't have extremes anymore. We just need the center. And when I read your book and I'm shoving it down people's throats of read this book, because it shows why the center cannot hold. You have a progressive audience here, but help us take the
right.
argument to the centrists of why we cannot just sit there and think that the status quo is going to get us back to where we need to be in 26 and 28.
I mean, at this point, I don't even know what people mean when they say the status quo. I mean, the immense amount of change we've had in the last 2 or 3 months is, I mean, shocking. And you certainly can't say that Trump and his administration are not following through on their campaign promises. Um, and I think the way I have seen our political order, even basically since I was a kid, was that the kind of normality that we had was being kept up with a series of kind of I don't know if corrupt is the right word, but unwieldy bargains. And on the right, essentially, you had a party, and this was already evident in the Bush era. I think it was even evident before I was born. You have a party that increasingly is moving rightwards on economic issues, that wants to dismantle the state. It has an electorate that actually does not want to dismantle the state, right? And I think this is part of where Trump's popularity comes from. It has an electorate that likes Medicare, that likes Social Security. The Republicans want to dismantle that. And the way that they do so is through cultural issues, through dog whistles or overt whistles at this point, right? They have cultivated over the last many decades a base that is overtly racist and nationalistic and misogynistic. They, are talking about repealing the 19th Amendment and disenfranchising women. They're quite open about all of this now. And that is how they keep their base on board. At the same time, the Democrats, instead of staking out their own kind of progressive, robust vision, have kept sort of drifting rightwards and chasing those voters. And that increasingly alienates voters who the Democrats might be able to get on economic issues.
Mhm.
The Democrats, with the somewhat exception of Joe Biden, have basically been playing from the same kind of neoliberal playbook of, yes, let's roll back the state, let's decrease benefits, let's increase the number of work requirements to access Medicaid or what have you, and which I think is fundamentally not a popular position. And so I think that both parties are pursuing fundamentally untenable politics, and that eventually something is going to give way. There's the structural issue that because we have such a highly polarized country with a form of government that has so many block points, so many veto points, that parties can't enact their agenda other than, as we're seeing now, through executive orders, through decree, essentially, or, as we're also seeing now, through ignoring court orders.
Mhm.
And I think the Republicans have a structural advantage because most of what they want to do is to stop change and to, they want to pass tax cuts, they want to get judges appointed. They're able to do that with bare majorities. The kinds of, progressive policy that Democrats want to do require much more robust majorities in Congress as well as the presidency. And so it all just, to me, for quite some time now, has seemed untenable. Like it is going to be headed towards some kind of radical change, which is exactly what we are seeing now with the Trump presidency. And I think that Democrats who think there is a status quo or a sort of pre-Trump normalcy that we can go back to are deluding themselves.
I keep saying on the show, you're a radical now, whether you want to be or not, because of everything that they're doing. So loop us then into how queer theory in your book, as you get towards the end of the book. And if you're just tuning in, we're talking with Dr. Samuel Clues-Huneke, a associate professor of history at George Mason University, about his book from 2023, A Queer Theory of the State. The first part where you introduce, kind of beginning to introduce your vision of this, as how queer theory can help us, is the idea of queer democracy in an I versus the us.
Mm-hmm.
And you're advocating for an us. Walk us through that.
So I think one of the insights from queer theory, from thinkers like Judith Butler, is that not only are identity labels like your class, your race, your gender, your sexuality, these are social constructs, but the very idea of you being an individual, of you having an individual consciousness independent of others, is also, to some extent, a social construct. And actually, it's interesting, Judith Butler, their philosophical training was originally, they were a specialist in Hegel, the 19th century German philosopher. And this is an idea that comes from Hegel. This is an idea that has a much longer pedigree in kind of phenomenological philosophy and psychology. This idea that essentially in order to create an I, you need someone else with whom to converse, to oppose, to sort of construct that I against. And so what Butler and other thinkers take from that is that the individual and our own agency, our own sense of being an individual, comes from social configurations. It comes from there being an us. You can't have an I without there being an us first. And so what I try to do in the book is take that a step further and say, if our liberal order is predicated, and I think it is, on this individualistic idea that, I am a free agent and the state should get out of my way and should, protect my individual liberties, and it should do that for each individual one of us. If we instead move to this broader notion that there is no I without other people, it, I think, enables us to think more holistically about what the state should be doing. That the state is not just there to protect my own narrow individual interests, because I do not exist without the people around me. The consciousness that I am does not exist in the way it does without all of my friends and family and colleagues and neighbors. And that once we get to that point, it's possible to start imagining a kind of communitarian state that is interested both in protecting the individual, but also in protecting the community and looking out for the interests in the community. And it's possible for individuals to recognize that perhaps a policy is not sort of the best policy materially for them in a narrow sense, but it benefits the community as a whole. And I think that it's not hard to reach for examples, right? Like, we pay taxes. I personally would love living in a world where I had a social safety net and functioning roads and sewer systems and so forth, and didn't have to pay taxes. Unfortunately, we live in a world where we do pay taxes for these benefits that we all like and we all, get a lot out of. So it's more of a kind of effort to take the insights of queer theory and put them towards a shift in mentality, that it's not just about me. It's not just about me as an individual. It's also about the community. It's about all of us. And what I think is that Republicans, or a lot of Republicans and MAGA people, they actually get that. They draw very different conclusions of where we should go with that. But the idea that the state exists to serve the interests of a larger community is something that you see coming out of the mouth of people like J.D. Vance.
Just a very specific community that we're not part of.
Yes, no, exactly. And I think that's why it's important to then get into the details about what we mean by this. And to me, it does mean the entire community, right? It means an expansive idea of community that, as I say in the book, ideally encompasses everyone on the globe, right?
Can you talk more about that? And I don't want to be coming across here as as having a critique of your idea for the sake of critique, but something that I was getting a lot of in the conversations I was having with friends
Mhm.
over the weekend is we need to start talking to the other side. And I'm like, well, how do we start talking to the other side when they're trying to stab me in the back and they don't believe that I should exist? How do I sit down and talk to a Marjorie Taylor Greene? And so walk me through then that
Mhm.
that community that we can begin to create here, because at the end of the day, we don't want to deport our political enemies, even though they're going to try to do that now. And apparently they're just going to ignore court orders to do that. But where on our side of things,
Mhm.
how are we building out that larger community?
I think this is a great example of like what the book is about,
Mhm.
because I agree. Like, I don't know that there's a way to talk to like Marjorie Taylor Greene specifically, right? I've never tried, but from videos I see of her, in Congress on Twitter or TikTok, I don't think she's an easy person to talk to. That said, I grew up in Kansas. I grew up surrounded by people who vote Republican and have beliefs that I don't share. And I have found in my life that there is a way to talk to these people, because at the end of the day, we are all human. We all do have similar fears and desires, right? We all want to live comfortable, interesting lives. We all are afraid of our loved ones being hurt or dying. We are all afraid of disease and natural disaster, right? I mean, I could go on and on.
Right.
And I
Can
think
we leave it
starting,
there?
oh, yes.
Just real quick, I got to fit in one more break, but lots still to get to here on The Gailey Show with Dr. Samuel Clues-Hunicke, author of A Queer Theory of the State. We're going to have more after this break. Keep it tuned here. Welcome back to The Gailey Show. I am your host, John Parker. Just before the top of the hour, it's our Thinking Clearly, Thinking Queerly episode. My guest is Dr. Samuel Clues-Hunicke, Associate Professor of History at George Mason University, talking about his book, A Queer Theory of the State. Before the break, we were talking about the community, creating the us, that being, you feel like the where your book is headed there. Walk us through then the rest of where we can get to with a queer democracy.
Well, I don't pretend to, again, have all the answers by any means, but I do think
you do articulate, though, a sort of a macro level.
Yeah, no, so I think
that. Yeah.
It is a vision of the state that sort of moves away from this idea of solely being interested in the individual and sort of looking at things through the lens of the individual. I think we do, a democratic form of government at the end of the day. One of the worrisome trends is I think there's a lot of skepticism in democracy, especially from young people, but on both sides of the political spectrum, because both sides can point to people being elected who they think are abominations, and saying, look, democracy leads to these horrible outcomes. And I think that is incredibly dangerous when we think about what the alternatives are. And I think that queer people need to be able to kind of embrace the state and embrace state power and think constructively about, okay, what do we want? What is it? Not only do we want government not to do, but what do we actually affirmatively want government to do, and how do we get there? I think another piece of it is starting to make really clear that queer politics is not just about trans people. It's not just about gay people. It's not just about lesbian people. It is about literally everyone having the ability to lead the kinds of lives that they want to, so long as they aren't hurting other people, right? Within certain bounds, it is about living lives free of this kind of insidious power of both norms and laws to kind of constrain human freedom. And I think starting to articulate that more clearly and not making it about these sort of narrow identity categories that I think at times people like Clinton and Harris struggled to articulate, probably because they themselves don't know or don't have a clear concept of what trans rights has to do with Social Security. And I think to my mind, there's a very clear connection here. It is about creating a government and a state and a society in which everyone is taken care of, everyone has the same basic freedoms and basic protections, and a sort of social welfare net undergirding them. I also think that there's a very clear trajectory from attacking trans people to attacking gay and lesbian people to, as I said, disenfranchising women. This is all part of the same sort of spectrum of oppression that certain people in our country want to enact. And so I think starting to articulate that more clearly, while at the same time recognizing that allies, people who fundamentally share a similar vision, we aren't always going to agree on everything. We aren't always going to use the same strategies and the same language. I think this is what I was getting to before the break. When we talk to people, it's important to try and find common ground and to not kind of jump down people's throats at the first provocation. A really good example of this, when I was a TA in grad school, I had a student who used the word homosexual, which is now oftentimes considered derogatory. And everyone in class immediately started attacking her and saying, you can't say that, that's discriminatory, you're homophobic. And I just sort of called them off and said, this is not helpful. This is doing no one any good. And I think that there has been a moment where progressives have felt not only entitled, but like they kind of need to enforce a kind of linguistic correctness. And then Republicans overblow that and use that to censor books and et cetera, which is a huge problem. But I think there is a kind of linguistic barrier to talking with some people and to making clear that progressives are interested in everyone's welfare. We are interested in ensuring that everyone has a good life and a good standard of living. And that is sort of, to my mind, the most important thing that we need to keep hammering home and talking about.
The linguistic thing is a big deal. And I'm sure that you've encountered this of trying to deal with the acronym drives everybody nuts. See, and I'm like, I don't want to get into the acronym right now, because I actually think that it's beautiful and deconstructing, if you will, even though I have problems with Derrida. We're not going to get into that right now. But the idea that, sexuality and gender is just so much more expansive and beautiful. And why wouldn't you prefer to have that than to have, M and F and that be the end of it? But I agree, and I think that there's a thing in trauma studies around vigilance and hypervigilance, and I feel like we tend to err more right now towards the hypervigilant, where if you use the wrong word, that is immediately indicative that you are going to betray us, a la Gavin Newsom, where it may just be a, hey, I'm trying to do the right thing here, and I used the wrong pronouns, or I used, the wrong word, but my intention is to get to where, I'm going. And I think that hypervigilance is, we do need to question whether that's serving us when we always have our knives out. How do you create these? And I saw it in an article this week from LGBTQ Nation of imperfect alliances, where we can allow space for the imperfection. But
yeah, and I think, we can, I have always thought Gavin Newsom is sort of sleazy, and this has, long before he did that podcast with Charlie Kirk. I mean, he reneged on his promise to back high-speed rail as soon as he was elected governor, and I've never sort of trusted him as a politician. And I think that as progressives, we have to be able to call out people like that and say, hey, wait a minute, like this, what you're doing in general is not progressive. But that, to my mind, that is constructive critique. That is saying you have been elected and you are not sort of following through on what you were elected to do. Whereas if we're having conversations with voters, if we're having conversations, among each other, with friends, with colleagues, it shouldn't be about scoring points. It shouldn't be about proving that you are, the better, the purer, the more progressive. Exactly. It's about finding common ground.
Exactly. I love talking with you, Sam. We're going to have you back here. We're including links to Dr. Hunicke's books in our show notes and on our website. Visit his website, samuelclewshunicke.com. He is also on Blue Sky. You can follow us at thegaleyshow.org to follow him, or you can just look for his name. Thank you, everyone, for listening today and or watching. Stay tuned. The Matt McNeil Show is coming up next, and after that, Native Roots Radio. See you back here at 2 p.m.